Good. I'm actually getting the hang of this. I actually managed to figure out how to fade it to black after it's finished and then fade it back into the mistakes.
Continue. We were talking about the calendar material. It was welded cut, and then the heels as they were added to various components, and all the characteristics which are independently variable throughout the process, and then which come together in a combined form in the finished shoe. It's a little bit better picture of the heel positioning and the string which will come out. And I've had cases where this string was visible in the impressions, and these are typically hand cut and often different sizes and shapes. And they're just attached. They're very sticky, unvulcanized material, and just pressed against the approximate area of the outsole, and then they, of course, become bonded to it when they're vulcanized.
Can you go over that?
Okay, yeah, the factories that I've been to, of which there are 3 that I've been to so far in this country, do not use that string, and when I've asked them, they have never seen it. And I presume it may be something which is one of many possible ways of attaching the heel to the shoe, and so I've never actually seen it. But I'm presuming I've seen similar things like that used in the footwear industry, and I'm presuming that there is something between the heel and the outsole that string can wrap around, and then by pulling it, it will pull that heel against the outsole and hold it in that position tighter until it's vulcanized together. You don't see it if the heel is the unvulcanized calendar material that's just been cookie cut or die cut out, and and you have, so this part here as well as the heel would both be sticky and unvulcanized. You won't need that if you just press them together and they stay that way. But because this heel was a molded heel and it's already hard and vulcanized, and it doesn't bend or conform as well, typically you will see a lot of this. And I mentioned earlier about the fingerprint. You can see it in here. I think you can see it. You see that fingerprint in there? That's simply the operator that grabbed the shoe in that position. It's a real good illustration of how soft that material actually is. You can see that there is a beveled bottom. Here's the beveled edge of that welding cut. And that's still very obvious on this type of a boot. And you can see that the boxing strip here with the yellow color, you can see the seam of it, and this steel shank label has been added to it. And the upper, which are also unvulcanized rubber. And down in this area here, which you can see is so sloppy, typically some factories will have a little bowl of unvulcanized rubber latex, black rubber latex. And if there happens to be a little bit of gap or void area where those pieces didn't go together well, they'll take that thick latex material and just kind of fill it in. And I suspect what might have happened is the person that was using that material might have had some on their finger and left this, or they just really grabbed the boot real hard without thinking about it. These boots also have molded heels, and here you can see the mold numbers. Very often you will get different molded heel characteristics, which add to the add another factor that you would have to have in order to have another boot or pair of boots of the same characteristics. Here's your string over here and over here, and you can see the position of that string as well as the characteristics of it can be different. Also, a lot of times, although I don't think you can see it real well here, notice this heel, instead of the front, instead of dropping straight down, it kind of flares out. And if you were to look at it from the side, you will see it kind of goes from a high spot down, tapers down to the bottom. And the last factory I went into, which is not where these came from, which was up in La Crosse, This had some flash on it, and they just literally tore it apart. And you can see that here, not as well as I saw at another factory, that you can see some jagged and unevenness along that leading edge of that heel. And of course that tear is just simply a random tear, so this is another characteristic which is going to be a little bit different on each boot. You have your made in Korea that runs along here, which is not, the lighting in this picture not as evident. You can see, I think, some differences between the position and the cut of this stickle and size label. I think in this one up here you can see a bulge. Can you see the bulge there? And that's from that material that's tucked beneath. And if this boot was to wear some additional, when you get some additional wear in it, typically your wear may start showing up in this direction. And that type of wear would be wear associated primarily with the bulge beneath the boot there, not the person's wearing characteristics.
On the bottom of those soles, it appears, some areas are shiny and some are dull. Is that glue there or something? What is that?
This is...
well, I'm looking at the sole portion.
Up here.
There's areas that are shiny and dull. And I was just wondering if that's some kind of glue.
There may have been some ink or something on there for me making impressions of this. Now down here, you're getting it because it's a molded. You're getting in the side of the mold. It's nice and smooth and reflective. Whereas in here, it's calendared. But this part up here, I think, is from some kind of impression-making material. This goes back a long way, so. Can you change the slide carousel, please? There was one down here in the. Here's your welding cut. There's not a whole lot of bevel on this. Here's your die cut. It's really not important as to discern whether it's a die cut or welding cut, because both cutting methods can and do have a lot of variables. If you have calendared material, of course you have to factor that in. Cut shoes can offer you a lot of characteristics in your impression that you can correlate with your shoe. Question?
On the Wellman cut, since the blade is moving basically parallel with the plane of the shoe, do you expect to see any lateral striations as opposed to the vertical striations?
No. It kind of draws the rubber. It doesn't.
There's no real cutting action?
It goes around like that fast, and it's basically just plowing its way through the rubber and pushing it aside,
okay,
as opposed to actually cutting.
Okay.
Just looking at a few shoes that are typically cut. This is a very common shoe you'll find all over the place. And if you look at the characteristics, that's kind of a general shot. If you look at the characteristics up real close, you can see that the boxing strip, that strip that wrapped around the shoe, you can see where it's a little bit of an overlap together. You can see that the Ked's label here versus there, and the alignment of the center of the heel with regard to these other characteristics, as well as the specific cut of this textured material. If you look at all those in combination with one another, and if you were to go into a shoe store and take, say, like 4 or 5 of one size of the right shoe and look at them, you're going to see that they're all different. Now, a number of these characteristics, such as the cut, inevitably are going to repeat again. Depending on what kind of detail you might have in an impression with regard to these, as far as their position where they meet, that's going to repeat again. And likewise, the label up here, which often shows up in a 3-dimensional impression, or as the shoe wears down and that label starts becoming level with the surface. So, someone asked after the first hour, he thought that these characteristics were very strong and that a lot of these shoes would be identifiable. And my words to him were, yeah, that's probably true in some cases, but you really have to feel extremely strong about it and know a lot for sure about the process of that particular shoe. And I would rather you treat this as an introduction, and because a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous. And There are shoes, which I'll show you in a moment, pass one around that simulate this, and they're actually molded. They're all exactly the same. And so what I'm trying to do is to introduce you to a lot of things that go on in the factory. If you have an actual case, I hope you don't just say, gee, I'm not sure, and go back to step one again and don't use it. But I want you to understand that some of these have tremendous potential, and they really need to be treated on a case-by-case basis. Some things that you can absolutely conclude, many things, from just looking at the shoe with your experience. But there's also some things you can be, that you have to kind of guess about or have to contact the factory about. And I hope that you would try to use them, but be cautious in doing so.
Are you going to talk at all about the calendar roll and the manufacturing of that and where? Can you talk about that at all?
Well, I've never seen one made, and there's only one person outside of Chicago in Rock Island, Illinois. That's one of the other factories that uses calendars. Apparently, a person there who is the only person left that repairs calendar and makes calendar rolls in this country. And as I mentioned, if you go to the industry shows, nobody knows about this. It's weird. They're all into the molding and injection and all the stuff that are typically to survive the industry in this country. And if they were to use this method, they would not be able to compete financially. This pair of shoes here is right here, and I'll pass these around. And you can see in the next few slides that these shoes, which I don't think these are bad shoes at all, they just have an awful lot of characteristics on them. For instance, you've got the China, made in China. You've got the little size designator here, which is not even close. You can see a multitude of raised areas all throughout the outsole on the bottom of these, which is calendar damage, little nicks and bangs to the calendar. If you look down at the heel areas or the toe areas, you can see, let me give it a closer slide. Well, let's look at the side first. You can look at the boxing strip and going around the heel. This one goes all the way around. Here's the beginning point of it. Here's a toe cap that just goes around the toe. You can see how much distance is between here and here versus the opposite shoe, inside of the shoe. So that's boxing strips moving up and down around the shoe. You can see how it's been depressed in certain areas by the fingers of the person putting it on. Question?
Is there any significant difference between the term you used, skin covering, and foxing?
No. The skinning was just, that's a whole different process.
Does it serve a similar purpose?
This is just a strip of, no. This is just, the reason they put this boxing strip on, and this afternoon we'll talk about molding unit soles where you just mold a shoe bottom. Whether it's a molded sole or a cut sole, you can put this boxing strip on it, and then you're covering that seam where that sole meets the upper. That's all that's doing, really. Okay, that just gives you a little bit of a closer view. Here you can see the light's a little better. You can see a lot of mold or calendar roller damage. The stippling, in this case, you don't have a herringbone pattern, but especially if you have a two-dimensional impression, you're stippling your little dot pattern in here. Of course, it's going to be different all the way around the calendar roller, and that's basically your pattern again. You have that cap around the toe. You have it beginning here and ending over here, and over this one you have it from here to here. So the beginning and ending positions of those vary. That's typical among a lot of toe caps. And then a lot of other shoes, they look like they're exactly as they are. So by looking at the left and right shoes of the shoes you're examining, a lot of times you can see what's going on in that particular factory process. You can see if they're way off, and Converse, Chuck Taylor All-Star shoes are like that, and these shoes are typically like that, where they're just put on by hand, They're unvulcanized material that stretches a lot as it gets pulled around. They may be cut off a piece at a time from a roll of that material, so you get a tremendous number of variables in that alone. Also, typically, that toe cap material may tuck underneath the shoe, and so you'll get part of that printing as part of the outsole. And a lot of times it won't come down to the bottom, you won't get it at all. So you have all of these variables in there. You can see that just the length of this bar versus this bar, and this one's kind of bent, crooked, versus this. You can again look at your letters and the word made in China. You can see they're easily discernible. Sure.
This is calendared outsoles. Either die cut or welding cut. The size indicator is on that piece of metal. How do you get so much variation in position?
I've never seen one like that.
Got it changed a little bit. Heel. Seems like it's really very hard.
Well, yeah, I know what you're saying. Why is this in this? There are other ways of sticking that on besides a template. I was guessing this is a situation here that might have been stained on by hand or something else put it on, and that's why one looks like it's upside down and there's a lot of risk. That's a good question. Okay, any questions about the cutting methods and the calendaring and all? I realize it's a lot, and now we're getting into molding, which is the other half, and that's a lot as well. It is confusing because the cut methods use molded materials, and when you get into molding, sometimes they use boxing strips that are unvulcanized and send them through the autoclave as well, and it gets, there's a mixture here, and that's just typical of the industry. Okay, your two primary methods of making molds are, first of all, the hand engraved mold. It's either hand milled or hand engraved, and essentially what that says is the operator is guiding the molding device. So there's a human factor in there. And the second is CAD/CAM, computer-assisted design, computer-assisted manufacture, and basically it's also milling with similar milling instruments, the metal out to make the mold, but in this case, the computer is directing that milling bit. Another method which we'll just briefly show a couple slides on is a casting method. That basically involves making making a model of a shoe and then making a cast from that model and subsequent casts from that master case. And then the spark erosion milling, or EDM, that's a method which an entire mold probably, as far as I have never been able to find one that was made that way, but it may be used to make the label or logo area or some small part of the case. First, the hand milled or mechanical process involved basically a pantograph, where you're going to put a template over here and bolt it down, and that is going to ride through the design of the template. It's going to transfer that design over to where you're routing out the mold and the piece of metal that you're going to route the metal out of and make the mold to be sitting over here. And the operator would typically have a hand on both of those and just guide them by hand. This is not a real good example of a template, and again, this is Murphy's Law, where the day you go through the factory, they're not using anything that you would hope they were using. But you can see this edge and this edge, and so are not very straight. This is just an oversized Vibram type. We say Vibram because everybody kind of generally describes this boot design as a Vibram design. But you can see how shorter that is than that. And typically they would probably be using this for a smaller size that only extended that far. And they're going to run that design on a pantograph and transfer it over into a mold where they're routing it out. Now normally they have templates to make one design as opposed to just this one template. And schematic, which is in that handout that I'll send you on manufacturing. And this is just a little simplified drawing to explain some of the things that can happen in hand engraved mold making. You had 3 templates: your herringbone design, your little V in the heel, and your S shape up in the sole, which is an old favorite amongst herringbone design shoes. And through your pantograph, that mechanical arm device that was just there, you're transferring these designs into 2 separate molds. You've got some choices. Either you're going to use the herringbone and keep that in the pantograph and change the metal molds and do the herringbone all at once, or you're going to leave one mold in and go through all 3 of these and then go back and take them out and do the one on the right. What's the removal and replacement of the templates and the mold blanks, you're going to get the design to register differently with the perimeter, and the combined designs are not going to combine the same way from even in identical size and shape molds. That's just one of those things they were doing, and I didn't really want to take a slide of it, but that's a piece of metal that they're in the process of routing and design into. Not a very good example. Okay, the second method, the computer-assisted design, computer-assisted manufacture. In this case, the computer is storing the design of the shoe, and it can either grade that design upwards or downwards or change it for each side. It will direct the milling of that mold blank specifically, or exactly the same each time. This is the cam portion of the CAD cam, and these are all different milling drills, and they will all be changed automatically by the machine, and they will come out and position themselves automatically over top of the mold blank. This material is comes out here. It's kind of a milky material to cool the process down. You can't photograph it while it's operating because it's spraying everywhere. But basically, this is all being done by computer. Now, this CAD cams are usually used for uppers, but they are used by a number of manufacturers and companies for outsoles and making molds. But they're still a very, very small part of the mold making process, which you see labor cost typically is high, and a lot of philosophies on labor is different when they really don't want this system. They want a lot of people to be working. So the overwhelming majority of your molds are still made with the hand method, which is good for us because you get all of those variables, where typically in the CAD cam, you can make 2 or 3 or 4 molds of the same size, and they would be indistinguishable. I just threw this slide in there because it kind of gives you an appreciation for the combination of different things with what might typically have been blocked together originally as just a herringbone design. This was a case from a few years back where the shoe on the left, the parachute, this is just one of them, was flown up to me in the laboratory. It was a serial rape case. According to the investigator on the phone, they had the person, and they had their shoes. They flew them up and came in the morning, and the impression was on a piece of drywall. The impression did not agree. If you look at the left and right, you can see that the mold characteristics where this design meets this design do not meet in the same way. And I could see that by looking at the impression and this particular shoe. And when they came back in the morning and I told them that this was not the shoe that made it, they were somewhat relieved because that night the suspect had passed the polygraph. And 3 days later, they found the other guy that really did it, and these were his shoes, and they were exactly the same brand, size, stock number, color, everything. And there wasn't a great deal of difference in wear, and that part of it wasn't even evident in the impression. So I had to rely primarily on these characteristics. The mold characteristics, the way these designs were met these designs here and down here and other places did agree, and there coincidentally happened to be 11 cuts in that shoe which agreed with the impression. This shows how this very slight difference in the movement of the mold blank or the template resulted in just a little thicker bar here versus over here. You can also see the way this bar comes up just perfectly flush with that. If you look over here, you don't have anything close to it. The bar is way up here and there's one down here. So if you follow along how those designs meet, you can see that there's what appears to be the same shoe is really quite different, even in the same size and manufacture. And this is very typical of the shoes that you will find in stores. Now, again, you can go in stores and find that everyone looks the same, but there's an awful lot that look quite a bit different in this regard. Another case where the similar type of mold combination, mold combined features were used was in this case, this is a rather deep impression. If we were to go from this area up to the ridge of the shoe impression, it was about 3 inches. It was very mucky mud that was attached to the cast. When I received it, it was very hard to clean it off. There's a better picture of the other cast, I think. When I photographed this, this wasn't for exam, this was just for demonstration. I believe this one was a lot further away than this, and so it looks smaller. But the problem in this case was the cast impression was actually about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch than the shoe. And other dimensions, because of the distortion that was apparently caused when that person stepped in that deep, mucky mud, was prevalent throughout both casts. But there were a number of features of only, this is only 2 that I'm pointing to. There's kind of a, where these lines are routed at the end, there's a little area that steps down, which was on the suspect shoe. And over here, there's just a little tiny point that just where the 2 design elements, when they were routed out, they just happened to result in a little excess piece of rubber at that point. And you can see it here. And there were a number of other features, such as the channels that either do or do not run between the elements, which in this case I found out was added by the manufacturer to increase the flow of rubber. It wasn't even part of the original design. You can also see what I mean by the distortion, how this is kind of tilted to one way and of course it's not on the shoe. And what I did in this case, by looking at it, I saw such specific features, even though of the quality of the cast in many parts and the size discrepancy, such as these 2 and many others, I felt very confident that this was, in fact, made by a shoe from the same mold as this shoe. And so I went to Lumberton, North Carolina, to Congress, where they made this, and we pulled up the inside of the shoe on many compression molded shoes, which this happens to be, which are typical of your basketball or court shoes. If you look, if you tear up the inside of the shoe and look inside, you'll see a mold number, and there's some pictures of it. So we were able to tell exactly what the left and right shoe came from, and then we were able to go down to the factory, pull all of the possibilities out from that size and adjacent sizes, and without any problem at all, conclusively determining that the shoe that made this impression came from the same mold as this shoe. This is a couple of the samples, just to show you a little bit better detail, because it's hard to put on a slide with those casts. But if you look at the tip of the arrows, you can see the minor differences. And more easily, if you look, for instance, at this black arrow, you see that there is no channel running there, but there is over here. If you look, for instance, here, there's no channel, and over here there is. And you could just spend a lot of time looking at all sorts of differences throughout that. This perimeter and this area here and these rectangular areas were all milled separately and then the manufacturer added these channels, but was very shoddy about it. And there turned out to be 8 left and 8 right molds of this size shoe, and they were all made at one time by the same manufacturer, and they were easily distinguishable. And so what we essentially had in the crime scene was we had a pair of suspect shoes that was a left foot from one of the 8 molds and a right one from another one, and these are not kept together, but are mixed up. And then we had the same thing at the crime scene. It was easily demonstrable, and so you had a combination, which I've got a kind of a controversial slide later on, which I'm sure you'll like on class characteristics, and takes you through that same kind of scenario where what are your chances of another left from that mold and a right from that mold, just thinking along those lines. Okay, here's another example. In this case, there's a big difference here and here. Take a break for about 5 minutes and just get to this. Okay, I mentioned casting, and this is an actual wood model. This particular one's from Cherokee in LA. Here's your size designated here. This is, as I said, a piece of wood. And what they'll do is they'll take that wood and make an epoxy mold of it and coat the mold with a spray on type of the metal. And they can make one or more molds from that master mold. Now, all of the people I've talked to at the factory shows sell the equipment for this, and nobody would ever make more than one from this model. Then I'll show you some slides where in this factory that exact same thing happened. This is also a wood model, but this one's been covered, and you can see how it's been spliced together with various rubberized materials. Here's a little rubber name. You can see gaps between the splicing, some pencil marks and things. They've actually coated that wooden mold with a textured material in different designs, and they'll do the same thing. They'll make a cast out of this. Now, this is being done primarily, and it's being done increasingly, but primarily for open pore polyurethane methods. And in Mexico, they can have a cast made for about $400 and maybe $4,000 if they did it for conventional means. So they're saving a lot of money there. This is not real common, but it's increasing.
And what's the material of the cast itself?
I'm sorry.
What's the material from which the cast?
This would be wood.
Yeah, but when they make the model of wood, and then what's the cast?
It's an epoxy casting material, and then they have these machines that I can't think of the name of them, but they take a little piece of metal. Somebody may know the name, and they can somehow melt that metal and literally spray it onto the epoxy cast, and they make a positive and then a negative. And there's a whole many-step process they go through, which isn't worth going through. But typically, once you start looking at things, you can pretty much look at shoes and get an idea. Is there a potential of the design itself and the fact it's open pore polyurethane? If I walked into a store and saw a pair of shoes like this, that would clue me to taking any kind of mold characteristic and checking with the manufacturer first. Again, it's just experience and exposure. These are 2 outsoles made from 2 casts which came from the same master. And the only way you can see the seams and all, and the only way that you can discern them now is because that particular process gives you a very soft aluminum alloy cast. And you can see all these little raised nicks. And that's actually nicks pressed into the mold, which now come out as pieces of rubber. And you can see they're different. And therefore you know they came from 2 different molds. Okay, we've got a lot in the next hour, so if we can either just take a real short 5-minute break, I'd appreciate it, because it's going to be hard to get through what we have left. Or if you want to just stay, we can just... Okay. What's real important with regard to molding, is that at an angle or something? Maybe it's just that slide. What's real important in mold making is not only the way it's rounded out, but the stippling or textures, which is on the mold surface. And in the case of the cast that I just showed you, any texture or stippling could very well be from wallpaper or rubber or whatever they coat that wood design in. In those cases, if they may be more than one cast, it would be the same. But in the vast majority of cases, whether it's hand milled or CAD-CAM milled, the stippling is put on by hand. And if you look between similar areas of these two heels, you'll see the stippling superficially looks the same, but specifically is quite a bit different.
You said that's put on by hand?
Yeah.
Is that standard?
Yeah, I'll show you. This is a sample sheet of one of many sheets that a particular mold maker had. And typically, if you were going in there and said, I want 100,000 pairs of shoes in a certain size range, and I want kind of this design and that design, and they would sit down with you, and you may walk in and know exactly what you want, but if you didn't, they would hand you many of these sheets and say, okay, we want to put some stippling on certain areas. Which stippling pattern do you want? And you can pick it out. Many different types of stipples. This particular steel die is what places the stipple into the mold and corresponds to 1030. If you look further down there, we have that number on it. And this is a result here. This is a rubber molding of a piece of metal and several stripes from that. And as that steel die is struck, it's going to be turned. It may be at a different angle. They're going to hit it harder one time than they are another time. And so not only are you going to have these features, but they're going to be at varying depths with overlaps and different relationships. So in a very small area on the shoe where this hand stippling is done, you will wind up with a fingerprint, so to say, of the mold. And that will be unique to that mold and will not be on any other mold. This is a picture of a person taking a steel die and striking that design. This is sort of a textured design into the mold surface. What's the why is this
Maybe I should ask. No. Is this stippling put on only in the hand engrave or also the CAD?
Both. Well, there's some shoes that have no stippling.
No, I mean when it's applied.
Yeah, when it's applied, it has to be done by hand in either one. Now, you can also sandblast or chemical etch, and that's done to some degree with regard to some molds. That's typically not as deep. The stippling is usually the deeper, and you can see the pattern and how it turns. You can follow that pattern. You don't have the detail here, but you can, that pattern that is on the front, you can find little pieces of it all around the surface of the shoe. And you can see where it's repeating, but the combination of many repeats is going to be unique to that mold. If it were etched or textured, that's still going to be random, but typically that will not show up in an impression because it's so shallow. Okay. Here's an example of a stippling in blood on tile, pointing out a few areas here that correspond just for easy reference. Took an overlay of this known impression and put it over there. You would see unbelievable correspondence of those stippled marks. Obviously, in any question or impression, your detail is going to be dependent upon your receiving surface, the amount of material, in this case blood that was on the shoe, and some other factors. So you don't expect to get a complete rendition as you do over here, but you do get sufficient characteristics, sufficient stippling, and not by any means, not just the ones I pointed to, but you get sufficient to, beyond any doubt at all, tell that the shoe, this impression came from the same mold that made this impression. Okay, another example from a case involved a Puma shoe, and this was worn out sole. You can see the stippling coming up over into the rectangular box. Quite a bit different from this. But likewise, the stippling at the top. You can also see in the slide the different Puma sizes and the registration of the herringbone pattern. Where it intersects the various other designs that this size has to do with the force of the stamping applied. If it's hit harder, the stipple will be deeper. If it's hit at an angle, you know, one side, so you can get all those variables when that's applied. This is the same case with the heel, bottom of the heel portion. We had obtained samples of all of the certain size from Puma, and this was from one mold, this is from another. You can see they even used a different stippling pattern, even though they were both size 13. You can see, again, just pointing to a couple of features. The gross characteristics of routing that mold out are different, and so is the stippling. So there's just even though these are the same size and design and brand and everything shoes, and you know, we could be found next to each other in a shoe store. You have two size 13. There's a tremendous amount of differences.
Is it your experience then that the stippling produced on the molds for this type of manufacturer are always hand done, or are there?
You can have chemical sandblasting, which of course has to be done by a person as well, and those are typically shallow designs. But the deeper stippling, hand stippling design is still done by hand.
Still done.
And I last checked last year at a show by the president of one of these big CAD/CAM companies, and I think it may be a couple of years on a very limited basis. They may start to see the very beginnings of doing some part of that with the computer, but it's still experimental. And, they think it's going to be a long time to come before it becomes practical to do it any other way than by hand.
So at this point, then because of the hand process, stippling would be an excellent feature to differentiate between various molds, I would assume.
Oh, absolutely. And,
okay.
Although it does, it's a very small area of stippling. This is a mold.
Okay.
I don't have a slide to show it, but in this case and in many other cases, let's say that you have a shoe that's worn and this is worn off. This has been worn down because you got the shoe 2 months after the crime. But in the impression, you can see the imprint of the stipple. If it's a case where you can take the suspect shoe and pull the inside out and get the mold number, you can go to the manufacturer and get a sample from the same mold and ascertain whether or not his shoe came from the same mold as the one that made that stippling at the crime scene. You know what I'm saying? So you can, a lot of people say you don't get a shoe right away, so that's not true at all. There's also things we can use to get the benefit of this information. Here's another case where there was actually some circular milling marks. The actual turning of that milling bit in this particular case down here and up here, you can see them best. There were also some kind of defects over here. I don't know why all of a sudden it focused on one side. You can see a little bit of a imperfection over here, kind of like a little check mark and some depressions. And those characteristics in the test impression show up here. You can see the circular design here, and again, this little check mark and other characteristics. The slide I have of this transparent lip is not very good at all, but I think you can still see the circular, particularly down here, and that little check mark. Okay, that would involve the mold making, and that, it seems that no matter how your shoes are molded, whether it's be compression or injection or open pore, that typically the characteristics that seem to be of most value to you are linked to the way the mold was made and the stippling. But to go through the molding processes, you have the compression molded, which is an open mold, and this is like making a waffle, where you open the mold, pour in the batter, close the mold, and if you have too much batter, it squeezes out the side. Your injection molding is a closed mold, where your mold is going to be tightly closed, and then a material will be injected into it. And thirdly, you're going to have the open pore molds or reaction molding that polyurethane methods use. The compression molding. Basically, you're taking a biscuit of rubber or some kind of a pre-measured material, and you're placing it into the mold cavity. The mold is then closed, and under heated pressure, some of them are actually shorter than 8 minutes, but normally in 8 to 20 minutes. Any excess material will escape out of the seams of the mold halves and be flashed, this excess material, which will have to be cut off. Compression molded shoes are normally, except there's only one exception that I've ever seen, and that's this tree torn shoe. They're normally unit soles. It's an individual sole unit that is later glued or stitched to the shoe upper. Okay, here's an open compression mold. This particular one has a hinge at one end. Sometimes they're not joined at all, and sometimes one half is mounted actually in a compression molded machine and the other slides in and out. Here's your rather old and crude compression molding machine. Your biscuit of rubber, your compression mold. This will be closed. The biscuit will keep the halves from closing completely. That when it's slid into here, this press comes down under tremendous heat and pressure and presses it together. These biscuits of rubber will melt and conform to the size and shape characteristics of the mold. And any excess materials will be material squeezed out to the side. That will be flash material, which will be later trimmed or removed from the shoe. Here you can see the flash material. Likewise, you can compression mold separate heels. We saw some of those earlier that were attached to the calendar material, welding cut material where they didn't have a heel design. And you see the nice smooth straight edges. And you can see the flashing here, which has to be trimmed away. This is at Quabog Rubber in Massachusetts. They're the ones that are commissioned for the Vibram designs. Vibram is from an Italian mountain climber named Borgrini, I forget his whole name. And he basically came out with this Stein, and the Italian food manufacturer, which is, I guess, Borgrini, commissions Quabog Rubber to make these soles in this country, and they have quite a lot of designs now. This is a compression mold machine. This is just the bottom half of the mold, and the top is mounted inside the machine, and their process, as you can see, is much cleaner. A good illustration of the differences. You'll go into some factories and you feel like you can sit down on the floor and have lunch, and others you have to hold your nose when you walk through. So there's just a tremendous amount of variation in the way things are run. This particular shoe is not going to have a heel on it. You're going to have to add a heel later, just like in the calendar method. And you can see, and we'll have a better slide later, but you can see all these little markings in there, and that's a date coding for their heel. You can take a case where maybe you have a body or a bag of goods, and we've had several like these. Most recently, I think any of you that know Laura Nelson up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, they had a case up there where people came across some skeletonized remains, had some boots on the skeleton. They were concerned it was a fairly recent murder. Turned out the shoes were made in the 40s. They found that all out because they were able to take the heels apart, and both the heel and the flat portion, they had the name of the manufacturer and the date coding. And back in that point in time, there apparently used to be a mental institution on the grounds, and they quickly changed the complexion of the case. So these are the biscuits of rubber. This factory's biscuits are so nice they almost look like shoes. And oops, let me show you something ordered. Here's a little yellow piece of rubber that says Vibram on it. Just like on here. Oh, they had another one. And that's just one way of coming up with two colors. And you can actually you'll find some manufacturers, they take a whole section of design and they'll build the mold so that they can separately mold a piece of, say, red design, and then just like this sits right into that cavity, they can take that piece and set it in there, and then put the biscuit rubber on it, and they can come up with 2-color, 3-color, 4-color designs, and that's how many of these multiple color and design molded shoes are coming out. There's also, when we get into the injection molding, I don't have any slides on it, but there's also molds where it will inject one color into certain areas of the mold, and then the mold configuration will change, and it will inject the other colors. So when you get into these real fancy modern shoes, pretty much you have to check with the manufacturer. You can tell something by looking at them, but say that the black rubber may be bleeding under, if this was a red insert or a yellow insert, bleeding into it, can look very much like these being injected first and then the black being injected secondly. So to be safe, if you have, it's unlikely colors are ever going to make a difference, but if you ever have any questions in those type of modern shoes, you really need to check with the manufacturer because there's just so many different ways of doing it.
Do they generally just apply the heat and pressure one time with their colors, or is that a step?
In this case, they just put that little yellow insert in, put the black biscuit oil over. It goes in there for about 4 or 5 minutes. This is one of the newer machines. It's shorter. It comes out and it's all done just like this one here. This is also compression molded. You're looking at the bottom of the mold into another big machine where the top is molded. Notice that this is a lot bigger than the mold cavity from which it came. And the reason is this particular material is expanded ethyl vinyl acetate, EVA. You've seen a lot of the shoes, some of them have the Vibrant name on it, some of them are other names. Particularly the ones I'm familiar with are men's shoes, even dress shoes, where you pick the shoe up, it's light as a feather. And if you look at the edge of it, it's been ground and it's nice and foamy, and it's expanded ethyl vinyl acetate. And what happens is they put the biscuit in, the mold goes in and it's shut under heat and pressure, and just as soon as that mold starts to open up, these things all pop out and just expand almost twice their size. I've got 2 of them in black, which, okay, here's some black ones. You can see again how much bigger they are with black together. And you can see how this thing just slides in and the top half of the mold is mounted underneath there. Then when they come out, they're die cut to, in this case, because Quabog rubber, it doesn't make shoes, but they make bottoms. And so, in this factory, so they're going to sell these to shoe companies that have commissioned them to make the outsoles for them. And these are much, much bigger, so they're going to die cut these to a certain size, like the ones I have here. And if you feel on the edge, you can feel that dies will have little guides or notches in it. You can feel the size designators. And eventually this will probably be mounted on a shoe in an oversized version and cut again by whoever they're selling it to. But these two, which I'll pass around in a minute, if you look in the back, they're from the same mold. The mold numbers are down in there. But you can see better on the slide if you hold them side by side. One has expanded more than the other. They're in the same mold, but if you perfectly line them up, you're going to see it's particularly noticeable in this area of the toe. One is much bigger than the other because one has expanded much more than the other. They even changed their formulations in different seasons because of this expansion problem. And again, they would not reject these. They don't go around measuring them. They're aware that it happens and they try to keep some control on it simply for the quality of the shoe. But typically, if you take 2 or 3 and come out in a row, they're going to be slightly different size. You can see this is much deeper because from here to here hasn't expanded as much as from here to here. You can see this is shallow, cut of the same die. Now you also can get your slight die variations from that oversize, but what we're just drawing our attention to here is the distance from this bar to up here and this bar to up here in terms of how much those bars have spread apart. shoe. They have these shoes in a more expensive version for serious tennis players. And this company, which has been very successful in recent years, to where they're one of the few success stories in this country in terms of opening up new factories to meet demands. They go to a lot of trouble to make these shoes, and this is the molded shoe that's directly attached but is not injected. And I kind of lumped it with the compression molded. And while I've got the slide up here, you can see that after it's molded, the operator will take the shoe and trim the edge. And you can see there's smooth areas and then there's designed areas. And as you go around the shoe, and I've got one here to pass around, you can see that they're all doing that by hand. So you're going to get some different characteristics around the perimeter of that shoe. This particular manufacturer also puts a little size designator in here. They use these first 3 bars. This is 1s, these are 5s, these are 10s. So this is, there's just two little dots here. That's going to be mold number 2, and that's mold number 2. But then when you look at the this, you wonder why they're both mold number 2. And you look down, typical of what you find in the industry. What they do in this case is they actually compression mold sheets of this rubber and then chop it up into little pieces in a way so that they get a very light, spongy compression molded rubber. And these are old. This company's a Swedish company, and they're real old molds that they brought over. And you've got basically the design here, and they'll cover this with a piece of tissue paper so that after the shoe is molded, it will release from the mold. And you can see that white tissue paper down here, and then they've added mold tabs in. That has the sidewall design of the shoe, or the midsole area. Putting a pre-measured amount of this ground up compression molded rubber in. Where these two halves of the mold meet, you're going to get a seam on the shoe, which is normally only associated with direct attached injection molded shoes. But in this case, they're coming out basically on compression molded rubber shoes. They can also put in little additional factors for cushioning or reinforcement, depending on whether it's their deluxe model or just their basic, whatever kind of shoe that all the girls in school wear. Now they take the shoe on a last, the metal foot form, and they just lower it straight down to the mold. In a direct injection process, the mold halves would come apart, and the shoe would lower down, and they would come back together. And this one is just literally sitting on it. And that mold's going to heat it up, and then you're going to finish shoe. And again, looking on the broadness of how that is routed. The reason they do that is get that tissue off. Over here you can see it's very spongy or textured. Basically hasn't been ground off. Then you have to grind it in there, and then it gets very narrow, and it gets wide. I don't know how well you can see that back down there. You can even see little pieces of rubber where that grinding was. So again, even though these are two different size shoes here, they just illustrate, you can see different stippling. Lots of different things also in this as well. And then the seam, and I'll hand this around, the seam is typical in the heel and the toe with a mold half joint. It's a much thicker seam than you get in an injection mold and pre-torn. In the toe, it very quickly seems to wear off as the person uses the shoe, particularly if they're playing tennis in it. This is a little infant shoe, and they only make in very small sizes, and because they don't need to go to the expense of making that rubber the same way and all to get a quality tennis shoe, they direct attach these with injection molding and get the very fine, hardly visible seam that you get in typically an direct attach injection molding. Okay, moving to injection molding. Again, this is a closed mold where the mold is closed and then the material is injected into it. There's It's used on, there's a couple typos you can see in the next few slides. Thermoplastic rubber, polyurethane, PVC, polyvinyl chloride, different materials. You can use rubber, but they haven't had a great deal of success with rubber, although they do have some rubber machines. Depending on the material, you'll have a variety of heat pressures. Also depending on the machinery. Injection molding is typically shorter. It may take a minute or less to mold the shoe once the mold is closed, as opposed to 5 to 20 minutes for compression molding. So typically, if you have compression molded shoes, you have more molds per size shoe, as opposed to injection molding where you might only need a couple in a particular size. And you can have injection molded shoes either in either in a unit sole, just an individual sole, or directly into the shoe. And this one was directly attached to the shoe. Okay, here's an example of two mold halves that are going to be joined together, and then through these channels you will have the material injected, and you'll come up with, in this case, a outsole. It's a unit sole. Here's the same thing that was in that prior picture. Here's one half and the other half of the mold, and in this case you can see the top half, you have that honeycomb effect to reduce the weight and the amount of material used in the sole. And those mold halves will be locked together before you inject that material. This is sole made through injection. You have an oval design here which has the name on it. But that particular factory had made that mold so that you could remove that oval with the name and put a blank one in. And I've had a case where they had, instead of just a blank, they had the same texture that was on the bottom of the shoe, except the texture didn't register properly with the texture around here. Obviously, because it wasn't all made once they cut out, there's no way they could ever get that to match. And the one I had was a circular one, and depending on which way the circle was turned, each time they changed its mold configuration, you could get variations that you could see. In the direct attach process, basically you have a mold bit for the design in it, and the shoe is lowered down into the mold, and the material, I don't think we sell too many of these shoes with those colors. The material is directed in the back and flows across and fills up the mold, and that material conforms and attaches directly to the shoe. There doesn't have to be any stitching or gluing. This is that particular slide. Here's another. I apologize for that. I got two in here out of order. Also, a lot of these direct attach machines are large revolving carousel types, and they can either have a mold where the two side halves come together, such as in that diagram, or they can be fitted with this dummy plate, which can come down just the bottom design and wind up making a unit sole.
How hot are the temperatures?
It depends on the materials. And I don't really have an example of temperatures and pressures, but typically if you like use a thermoplastic rubber, there's a lot of pressure and much more heat than if you're using polyurethane. No, oh no. And with polyurethane, you're heating the mold more to assist in the uniformity of the polyurethane reaction, whereas in other instances you're getting the heat pressure for other reasons. But I haven't collected all that information. Okay, again, a one-step injection or one-color injection a lot of times can be also injected to the bottom of the shoe, and typically on dress shoes you'll find this have seams from the left and right mold hands to the heel and toe. here's a mold where the mold hands will come apart. Here's your channel that's going to lead into this hole, and then right here and somewhere up here, I think right there, you're going to have the material come out. Now, might notice, made in USA, textured design, boxing strip, or at least if it's not a boxing strip, it looks like it. You know, pass around an example. This isn't from that movement. This is, as evidenced by the seam and the ports in the back. This is a direct attached shoe. It simulates the calendar material with a boxing strip. And I've had people in class mistake them just with their initial introduction, like we're getting today, look at it and say, gee, this I recognize because that's texture, like that's calendar, isn't it? And the real clue is the seam back here, but you also can distinguish it when the top of the shoes were cut off. This was directly attached to the shoe. But you can also tell upon close scrutiny that this is not handmade, hand-built up. For aesthetic reasons, when they make molds, a lot of times they make them to simulate the old labor-intensive process.
There's no, when the uppers are lowered into there and the material poured in, there's no glue to it past the uppers.
No,
it's just the bonding.
it just is absorbed by the material, bonds right to the material. Okay, another one-step process, and in this particular case, a spring last, where he's taking a string and wrapping it around a pin, there's a drawstring around the shoe, then it's lowered into the cavity, and this is molded on. And this little excess piece is known as the sprue, and where they'll cut that off, you'll get that little round point or port, and you'll get the seam from the mold heads. Okay, if you have a two-color shoe that's direct attached, now this has a gray bottom and a white midsole, and as evidenced by the seam in the heel and toe, you can tell it's been directly attached to the upper. First, there will be a dummy plate that comes in and seals off the top of that mold, and just the bottom portion will be injected first. And if you were to open the mold up then and pull it out, you'll get something like this, very thin shell. This one has a little velvet-like toe on it, and again, which is something that the mold was made so they can stick that down into the toe area of the mold, and it was actually molded right in there. Looking at this same as that diagram, but in a real situation, here's that dummy plate that's going to come down on top of this, and then this mold's going to close, and through the bottom injection port, that material would be injected. You'll get just the bottom portion of the design of that two-step process. This is what they would look like if you were to pull them out of the mold at that point. Good question. Let me switch slides. That bottom plate's got a piston on it, and it drops down, and the material's injected in, and then it closes together, so you don't get a seam there, but you do get the seam on the midsole. Okay, second step here, you already have that outsole there, then the shoe's lower down directly onto that, the mold half is closed, and here we go. This has already been molded, this is lowered down, the mold half's closed. The midsole, the white midsole material is injected into it. In this case, it's purple. And that's what it looks like with that mold tightly closed. You can see the seam right there. This particular material is polyurethane, which is a reaction molding, and when you inject it in, it expands and then backs back out of it. But in real life, that's what it looks like when it comes out. This is all the flashing between the gray and white areas. You can see that seam in the back. And you will also have a little one in the white part of the toe in front. And a person will have to take a little V-shaped device and run around that shoe and trim that flashing off. And if you look at it microscopically, you'll see a lot of hills and valleys and variations in there, and if you could have that show up, and I have had in some impressions and crime scenes.
And that's usually done by hand.
Yes, always been done. Here's the seam. Even on a shoe that's well worn, there isn't any down here because that, remember, dropped down in that particular process. You can see this is a polyurethane shoe with the shiny air bubbles that are on there. This is on a new outsole. You can see better the polyurethane air bubbles. You've got an article I handed out to you on polyurethane, so I'll run through that part fairly quick. Typically, well, this is one of these hard to take shots, that's why it's a magnet, but this mass here is polyurethane, and what they did was they allowed us to inject this material without the top being on there, and just to show how it does not fill the mold, but expands forward. It could also be injected from the bottom or the other side, and you would get expansion in opposite directions. This is in your handout. It gives you a lot of reasons for variations in polyurethane soling. One of the main variations is this is a mixing box where polyurethane is a reaction molding. You have a hardener and a resin in simple terms that come together and act. And in order to assure that reaction is complete in a qualitative, quantitative fashion, there's a high-speed mixing screw in this box. And then here would be the back of your mold where that little circular port is. This would move up to there, the machine would move it up, and this would be basically metered and mixed rather rapidly, and the polyurethane is going to start hardening in about 3 to 7 seconds. It's going to be all done. So it's a very quick qualitative, quantitative process. There's a mixing screw, and it's going to be turning at many thousands of RPMs, depending again on the machine and how big the screw is. And many machines, those screws just in an hour and a half can get very dirty and get hardened polyurethane on them, which makes them less efficient, and they have to be routinely removed and cleaned during the process. It's a quality control that they will use in a polyurethane operation, whether it be direct attach or open pour. They'll take what's called a cup shot. They'll take a paper cup, which this is a dissection of. They'll fill it up about halfway, and then that stuff, as it reacts, will rise like foam, and eventually it'll harden and form the skin. And they'll pinch the skin, and after so much time, and give it a pinch test. The amount of time it takes for it to rise is known as the rise time and cream time. In this case, on the left, you see a mixture from the machine after they put a clean screw in, and on the right is a dirty screw before they changed it. And you can see there's much more air and even a different coloration to the more air-filled mixture from the same machine. Typically, you get a lot of designs which, due to the minute quality of the mode of injection, the design itself, whether it's deep or shallow, and the density of the polyurethane, whether it's a 0.38 density or a 0.75, which is much more dense and harder, you will get a lot of air bubbles which typically reproduce with amazing similarity from outsole to outsole, and which could be mistakenly interpreted as identifying characteristics. They can, depending on the particular case, materials, and frequency of the bubbles and how close you can associate them with the impression, they can be used to contribute toward identification. Here are 3 outsoles. If you look at this real big asymmetrical bubble, and then that one's a little smaller, and that's a little smaller. But then you see some remarkable, amazing similarities. These are on 3 subsequently injected polyurethane outsoles from an Adidas factory which just recently closed up in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. Tremendous similarity of these pattern-related bubbles. But at the same time, if you take any area and compare many outsoles, you'll usually find when you start getting to 7 or 8 bubbles or a certain number, it's very hard to find them exactly alike. So you are getting variation, but you're also getting a scary type of reproduction of the same characteristics. If you dissect some of these, you'll also find bubbles which are not pattern affected because they're not touching the pattern, but they are in the outsole and they will appear there after the shoe is worn. And those are much more random bubbles because they're not influenced by the factors that were influencing the pattern-related bubbles. If you slice some of these shoe outsoles, if you look here, this is an upper layer, and then the next layer slice goes down here. This was done by Dorian Music in LAPD. You can see how the bubble patterns are changing and how we're getting a bubble here that didn't appear before. That's typically a pair of shoes you might get in a case where you, at some point in time, when this location didn't need you, you're going to clean them up and find those shiny air bubbles. Normally they're shiny even when they're dirty. Here's some air bubbles that are forming up in the outsole. This was originally stippled, and now these were submerged, and now the shoe is worn down and they're appearing. And these type of bubbles are much more random, and typically if you had a sufficient number of these bubbles that were worked, they could be used toward identification of the shoe, whereas your pattern-related bubbles, which are depending on your design and reproduced quite frequently, are less likely or less useful or independently using for identification purposes. Obviously, they can be used, for a number of reasons in your examination, but and of course, if you have a cut that's mixed in there with them, that helps a lot. But you typically don't want to fall into the mistake of identifying a shoe based on 4 or 5 totally pattern-related polyurethane air bubbles, because you're going to be able to go to the factory and probably find a shoe just like it. Okay, open pore molding. It's becoming more common. Basically, it's used primarily on unit soles. It's an open mold which the material is poured into and then the mold is closed. This is a sandal where we're having a direct attach process, even though mostly it's for unit soles. This factory is using a direct attach. Here's your sandal attached up here. Here's your molds. These were made from cast molds. These were some of the ones you saw that were a wooden design that was cast. Polyurethane is again mixed with a mixing screw and meter just up here, just like it is in direct attach. So as soon as it goes into this mold cavity, it's starting to rise and expand. Okay, the mold is closed after the polyurethane is placed in it. Here's the sandal. After a certain amount of time, which isn't very long, it's opened up, and here this has to be trimmed off. But basically, you have your direct attach sandal. Here's your left and right mold, and if you look at one real closely, you can see all the little nicks and dings, which are typical of molds made with this epoxy casting method. Every little thing that touches that mold seems to leave a characteristic in it. Here's the same kind of process with just a unit sole, where they're just basically pouring that material into the cavity. That this should have been closed. They left it open and taking pictures, and you can see this polyurethane is just rising right up out of the mold as it expands. Again, here's 2 outsoles from sister molds where you can see there's different molds because of the damage that has occurred to them. But at one time they were identical in theory. Just the back side of it. Here's a kind of unusual air pattern for the polyurethane. Get into different densities and different designs. You're getting all these little raised areas from the nicks in the mold, and all these little depressed areas, bubble areas, are from the polyurethane. At Vibram, they used an open pore, but it was a little bit more sophisticated. This particular boot, Vibram boot, if you look on the back, you can see there's the shiny polyurethane. On the front, though, because the density is higher, you're only going to get little holes in the corners occasionally. But probably if you dissected that shoe, you wouldn't find any air inside of it. So even though it's made of polyurethane, it's probably not going to be as significant in your exam as in a low-density athletic shoe. They will, this one I have here, take in this case the brown, dark brown area, they will take a compression molded rubber outsole, put it in the mold, through an open pour process, cover it with polyurethane. And these are two different ones they wound up with. This center area and this center area are compression molded rubber, and then they put them in the mold, and the rest of it is open pour polyurethane, so you have a combination. And I mentioned earlier that factories take all these basic methods. Now we're starting to see how they're combining these, but you can, if you understand all these methods, you can usually look and tell exactly what's happening. Okay, again, real quick, siped outsoles for deck shoes. This is a siped outsole as opposed to a shoe that's like this shoe design. In this case, we've got a blank compression molded rubber shoe. It's put on a siping machine, and one bar at a time. This jagged blade is going to hack in the siping design. And where that starts and stops, and where this meets the perimeter is going to vary, much like their herringbone design. Notice that these two bars are real close together. These are brand new shoes. And this is the same shoes after they've been worn for a while. And the protruding edges of these this design, as they open up, as the shoe bends, they're going to start getting ripped off. Good example of leading edge being torn with the areas that are receiving a lot of pressure. This was also covered with a boxing strip, and you can see that where it met wasn't complete. You have a big void area. Okay, that's that simulation came around that looked like a cut shoe with calendar material and a boxing strip label. You can see the seam in this case it has injection ports where the sprue came off, as well as the seam from the mold halves. And those are evidence that it's not a cut process or calendar process. Okay, these are Taylor Converse lookalikes that were direct injection by the seam instead of regular boxing strip is being on.
Question about the siping, is that always done after the sole shape is cut? Or is it ever done on a tack sheet?
And let me real quick show you, I forgot, let me just show you real quick something. Here's a siped shoe where the siping does not extend out to the end. And in the heel and the sole, it's just in the center part. And so the way that they do this, and if you look on the back, I don't know if you can see, but there's like a template design on the back. You can feel and see it if you angle it just right. And what they do is they take a steel plate, thick steel plate behind it, and then they take one blade at a time, drop it, one blade at a time, and where there's no steel backing on the edges, it does not leave a sight cut. Heel, they've done the same thing, but then they glue the heel to it, and you can see they haven't ground it evenly yet, it's still uneven. There was someone in the class in Wyoming that had a pair of shoes, and the shoe was a very complex pattern, cup sole shoe like this, but there was like a half moon area here and a half moon area here where the siping was in this direction, and then there was a segment over here where there was a little siping in that direction. And they did that simply by putting templates behind it and siping across the whole shoe, and then coming back and doing the same thing over here. It was very complicated. But again, where that sight begins and ends, and if it's all the way cut through or not, those types of things can vary.
Are those sight indexes, is it done by machine?
It's done very crudely, like you saw with the blade and the... Now, I've been told that there are siping blades that come with hooks, where you have a whole series of blades that sipes at once. But most of the people at the shows tell me that's not so. And common sense would dictate that if you had a size 6.5 through 13 or 14 of this shoe, just think of the expense that would be involved if you had to make a series of sight blades for every different size, as opposed to just making a flat template and doing it the other way. So I've never seen some people told me they felt sure there were patterns of blades that were all together and did it at one time, but most people say there aren't. Common sense would dictate that they would do it one blade at a time, just the templates. Oops. Okay, the stitching on the shoe, this is a little way stitching machine, and whether it's stitching through the bottom or through the side of the shoe, it's advanced in there primarily by hand. The machine will advance it, but the guiding and pressure, tension, and all that is quite a bit controlled by the operator. As a result, the stitches will typically, here's one that's a lot longer, here's one that's shorter. They typically will not be the same length or the same position. Here's a good case example, and if you look in the heel area, you'll see how drastically different those were positioned, and you'll also notice that the hole from where the needle went through to put that lock stitch in still remains, and this has proved to be very important on several examinations I've had, particularly one that was a contusion examination on a young lady. You can see a lot of difference here between the distance, and so you will have the remnants of those stitches even though the stitches are gone. And when you consider distances, but where they are in relation to these mold characteristics of the heel, then it becomes very simple. This is just a good example of a number of features. You've got variable stitching on the side and different types of various stitching and various stippling. And very often you'll get a cast such as we did here, where the stitches drop down, not only the position but the fact that it just kind of curved downward, and you can read the side of the main Patrick part of it. You can actually see the sidewall stitching as a part of that.
Is that real stitching or is that fake?
That's real stitching. Yeah. Now you will find fake stitching on some outsoles, yeah, but it's rubber. You can tell it's not. This is real. And there was very little detail on the bottom of the impression, but because the shoe went in sideways, we were able to find the Patrick and the stitching on it. Okay, the honeycomb effect behind the shoe will support a lot of the weight, and often you'll get that wear pattern coming through. If we turn one of these shoes over and take off the bottom, you can see why. And that also will occur. Okay, there's a good example of the mold number. Each manufacturer will put these in different places. This may be mold number 5, factory number 1. I mean, you can't look at it always and tell what it means. But if you take a picture of it and send it to the manufacturer, they'll know exactly what it means. Okay, there's a good example where each month or every 2 months, the manufacturer wanted to add a little doohickey and make a recording of it so they could go back and tell exactly when that shoe was molded. They do it to keep people from sending them old shoes and telling them they just bought them, and various suits and legal things. But we can use it for a variety of reasons, such as missing persons and skeletonized remains and so forth.
Now, is that inside the heel?
Yeah, that's inside the heel. Here's an insert in a shoe, and again, this stresses the importance of going to the manufacturer. If I told you to take a piece of paper out and write down what you thought this was, I know I would get a lot of different answers, all of them with good thought. The only way to really know is to ask Reebok in this case. This was their factory D, mold number 11, size 9. This is becoming more commonplace on shoes, multiple sizing, because we're in a world footwear market. You're going to see more and more of this, even 4 or 5 sizes eventually. And this is just the U.S. sizing system, United Kingdom, and the metric. Also, there are various size coatings on upper components, little notches and V's that manufacturers will put so they don't get mixed up which parts of the uppers go with which bottoms. And there is no universal size code schedule. This was one for this factory. Basically, you can see if it's got a V on it, it's a size 5. If it's got a V and a U, it's a size 8, and so forth for this factory. But they may use a size 8 tongue on a size 10 shoe. So again, you have to go to the manufacturer to get that information. Let me skip ahead. Well, real briefly, this was a recent case involving a lot of blood impressions on paper. I'm going to really zoom through this. There was like 4 different pieces of paper. They had dust impressions and blood impressions. You could see a lot of the stippling pattern and design. This was the significant one, and you can see this D from Adidas, DID, part of the A, and you can see it was angled. The way it was hand engraved in there was not in line with the rest of the shoe. This is a black and white impression, a picture of a blood impression. There were also on the same pieces of paper many residue impressions of a shoe, which I positively identified. And on one piece, let me fly by, that's the Pro Wing shoe. Okay, you can see this is a line this way, there's one this way, there's one in that way. Those are test impression overlays. Get to the, okay, this particular suspect was having his front porch redone. He was using an Adidas shoebox for a mailbox. It was an Nastasi Super shoe, size 8.5 for the U.S. sizing. The investigation determined it was only sold in Europe. The impressions of blood that were on those pieces of paper were from an Nastasi Super Adidas shoe, and because it was a direct attach shoe, they have to take a size, and that's the mold it came from. You can't put that shoe up or in a size 9 shoe, all the stuff will leak out the side. So, you know, if this was an 8.5, it had to come from one of their 8.5 molds. And we contacted Adidas in Severn, France, and from their factory there and 2 locations, their factories in Germany, which were all of the places, they sent us samples of all of the molds. And on the right each time is a sample from the one that agreed with the question impression, where you've got the reverse of it now, but it was at an angle. And if you look at the 8.5 on the left, look where the 8.5s are positioned. Look at some of the ones I pointed to red, and red the position of the Adidas. Hand engraved molds, very different, even though they're made for the same company. Outstanding shoe. And the one on the right's the one we were interested in, and the ones on the left are other molds that size 8.5 molds. This one even uses a different stippling. We tried even went to the 8s and the 9s just to make sure we could have some kind of a perfect fade. Okay, and if we can, okay, I've got 5 minutes left, and I've got one other group of about 10 slides. And like I said, we identified his impressions in residue that it was a relative, so we really couldn't, identify him as the murderer. But when confronted with the fact, he admitted that he had had shoes that once belonged in that bunker. They were shoes that were only sold in Europe, and we were able to go to the mold through the stippling and the mold differences to determine that in fact they were an 8.5 Nastasi that made the blood impressions. And we had a preliminary hearing right before the trial. It was a guilty plea, so it never went to trial. It was an interesting way of backtracking that shoe to the mold. Okay, real quick, I've got 5 minutes here. Class and identifying characteristics. In this book that I wrote that will be published in November, I tried to go back through literature that goes all the way back to the 1800s and come up with some definitions and that basically is a consensus of what the wavelength everybody's been thinking on in the footwear impression comparison. They kind of lacked definitions. Actually, a lot of these didn't exist, and I've tried to come up with them. I'd be interested after this is over if anybody has any comments about them. Basically, with regard to this is my definition of a class characteristic. And I've said intentional or unavoidable that repeats itself and is shared by one or more other shoes, or can be deemed possible as being shared by one or more other shoes. And combined class characteristic would be the combination of two or more independent class characteristics. And if you think about all these manufacturing characteristics that we talked about, each of those in most cases would be independent of the other. Remember that 69-cent sample that came around? If this was a question impression and this was a question impression, I'm going to see that it was an agreement with this known standard. It was not with this one. And basically what you have is one class characteristic being the pattern or the design of that outsole, and the second independent one being the particular cut. And in this case, both of those combined class characteristics agree. In this case, only one, the pattern, general pattern, agrees. Whereas if this was your question impression, which is just like an internal print of somewhere on the inside of the shoe, there's no perimeter and there's no prong plug that comes to the bottom. Basically, all you have here is one class characteristic, and so either one of these possibly could have made it. I don't know if we want to get into this or not, but basically I was trying to show in a theoretical way how an order of 75,000 pairs of shoes, 10,000 which were in size 10, made in hand-engraved mold pairs. They decided to make, for production purposes, 4 pairs of left and right size 10. So each, if they were distinguishable, you'd be making 2,500 left and right from each mold pair. So basically your chance then is 1 out of 4, 2,500 would be of each design. But then if you combine the left and right, you had both impressions that they probably have seen, then theoretically you can say only 625 out of the original 75,000 would have been that size, and then combine left and right. And if you added just one other characteristic, which such as a toe can maybe say there could be in 10 different places. Again, this is all just for theory purposes. You're reducing the original 75,000 pairs down to 6.25 pairs. And I agree that I'm not representing this as a real life example, but as a thought process type of a thing. But in fact, this kind of thing goes on, I think, as you've seen this morning, in the footwear industry. Identifying characteristics with regard to shoes I've defined as those which have resulted when something has been randomly added to or taken away from a shoe outsole, and which either cause or contribute toward making that shoe unique, shoe outsole unique. Added to would be chewing gum, tacks, rocks wedged in the outsole or wherever, and taken away would be cuts and scratches, so forth. Random infers that the size and or shape and or position of the characteristic depends on it. Rocky Stone had an interesting article a few years ago, and I asked permission for him to use it, where basically if you have one number in a hat, 10 numbers in a hat, what's the chance to draw number 5? It's 1 out of 10. If you've got your average shoe size and you take a metric grid, square millimeters, and put it over it, you're going to find that 16,000 different squares cover that shoe outsole. And so if you just are thinking of a little dark pinpoint type characteristic, what are your chances of another shoe having it in that same position, and it's 1 out of 16,000. Again, this is for thought purposes, not, we're not trying to report this happens in specific cases. This is to give you a think process for appreciating, identifying characteristics. Then if you get into combined occurrences, basically you have space factorialized, meaning if it's 16,000, it's 16,000 times 15,999 times 15,998 and so forth. And basically the same thing on the bottom. Try to get through this one bit. So if you have two pinhole characteristics without any shape or unique characteristics, just a pinhole out of that 16,000 squares, what are your chances of another shoe having them in the same 2 points? It's 1 out of 127,992,000 and so forth. You can see it goes up quite quick. This math, this part of the math has been validized. I know that's right. But weighing your characteristic toward an entity, not only do you want to confirm it, look on the shoe, make sure it's random, it's unique, but you also want to look in the impression, make sure that that's a result of heuristics. And the position of the characteristics, such as the problematical example we just gave, can also be added to by taking the uniqueness and orientation of the characteristic. It may have several points about it. The clarity is also important, and you also have to consider changes in those characteristics as the shoe wears. I think I have 2 more slides. I'll skip that one. Just, I'll tell you what, let's just stop here. If anybody has any questions about anything that I didn't cover, I'd be happy to hang around for a while and do my best to answer. Okay. Sorry I ran over, but should have talked fast.
On behalf of the California Association of Criminalists, I wish to thank you very much for your time and your contribution this morning. I think that I can safely speak for all of us that did very much from your presentation this morning. I certainly learned quite a bit that will be very helpful in future comparisons that I do, and especially in interpretation of various manufacturing features. And thank you very much.